Beyond Barbarossa, Episode 70, a talk with David Sumner of Europe at War. Welcome to Episode 70 of Beyond Barbarossa, the only English language podcast in the world to focus on the whole Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Redbeard Studio on traditional Anishinaabeg Algonquin land, also called Ottawa, Canada. Remember that you can get episodes early and ad-free by supporting the podcast through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support you'd like. To avoid missing an episode, hit that follow button and subscribe to FeedSpot for email notifications about new episodes. Today, I have a special treat for you. We're joined by David Sumner, host and producer of the Europe at War podcast, which tells the stories of some key battles at the end of the war as the Red Army closed in on Berlin. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. Hello, listeners. You may have noticed a small change to the description of the only English language podcast focusing on the whole Eastern Front of World War II. That's because there is now another excellent podcast that has a focus on the Eastern Front, or at least parts of it. And that's David Sumner's Europe at War, which you can find on all the podcasting apps. Europe at War digs deep into the details of critical battles, mostly on the Eastern Front, in the last weeks of the war. The first series of 15 episodes told the story of the Battle of the Halbe Pocket, east of Berlin. Now, assuming that you're listening to this podcast around the time that it comes out in March 2025, Europe at War is describing the Battle of Bautzen in April 1945. So I'm very pleased to welcome the writer, producer, narrator, and host of Europe at War, David Sumner, into the Redbeard studio. Virtually, of course. David remained in his studio in Berlin, Germany, where it was a sunny 19 degrees, while the temperature outside the Redbeard studio is around -4 Celsius. Welcome, David, to Beyond Barbarossa.
Thank you for inviting me onto your show, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very eager to get stuck into the questions.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing to do is to ask you to describe for our listeners, what is Europe at War? What's it all about? And what brought you to this very interesting subject?
Cool. Thank you very much. So the Europe at War podcast is my hobby horse, where I'm trying to do a long form audiobook series looking at particular battles on the Eastern Front primarily, although in future series I might move away from the Eastern Front. I felt that the Eastern Front's been an overlooked and underappreciated front of the war, especially in the English-speaking world. I'm British. My background is British, although I've lived in Berlin now for more than 15 years. I'm a dual nationality, British, German. So I also thought I could use this podcast to focus on those forgotten or overlooked battles which happened in Germany towards the end of the war. So we are coming up on the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. So I thought it was high time to look at some of the fighting which took place in Germany in April and May 1945, as those are also local stories to me. Like I said, I'm Berlin based now and have been for more than 15 years. So that's why I wanted to look at the battles which took place literally on my doorstep and bring them to the attention of the English speaking world, because everyone knows about the Battle of Berlin, but no one knows about the Halbe Pocket or even the Battle of Bautzen, which is my second series in the podcast. So that's what I'm trying to do with the podcast right now.
The first 15 episodes focused on the Battle of the Halbe Pocket, correct?
Yes, exactly. So the first series was focused on the Halbe Pocket because, very honestly, it was my first time doing podcasting. So I didn't know if I would be any good at it. I didn't know if there would be an audience for the content. So I said, I'll just tell one story of the Halbe Pocket, see where that goes. And the feedback has been good. And that's why I've decided to then keep the podcast going and tell other stories. But I chose the Halbe Pocket first because of the scale of the battle. So hopefully the people who are listening to your show would obviously be very interested in another Eastern Front story. But the Halbe Pocket story ticks off a lot of the kind of atypical things we've come to expect with the Eastern Front. So it's huge Soviet armies, come, almost rampaging through quiet German towns and quiet German villages. There's lots of death and destruction. It's a very desperate German army who are on their last legs, or maybe even worse than that, trying to hold the line in a very futile attempt at stopping the final Soviet onslaught on Berlin and failing. And what I also found really interesting with this story was that there is so much human drama within the Halbe Pocket that I felt was also ripe for storytelling purpose. The Halbe Pocket is not just about, the first Ukrainian front and the first Belarusian front facing off against the remnants of the German Ninth Army. It's also about the tens of thousands of German civilians and refugees who are also caught up in the fighting. So many Germans from Prussia and Silesia have fled those areas and come to Brandenburg and the Berlin area by April 1945, and they are fleeing the Russians, but they're going from the fryer, and they're going into a hot pan because they're just walking into another battle zone the minute that the Soviets launched their assault on Berlin. So that ripe story, that kind of human drama, was, I think, also what was appealing to me in terms of what I thought needed to be told. And what I'm also struck with the Halbe Pocket story is that I live very close to Halbe, and I've been there many, many times researching the podcast. And you can really still see a lot of scars on the countryside. The forests are still pickpocketed with dozens or hundreds of shell holes and foxholes from where you can see artillery rounds have come in and literally blown a hole out of the landscape, or defensive foxholes and shell holes were dug by the Germans and by the civilians trying to then, get some cover from the incoming Soviet tree bursts. It's all there. And I walk through the woods quite often, and you can still find the detritus of the battle very, very easily. Just kick back some moss and you'll find exploded gun barrels. I found hair combs from what I imagine were German refugees who just dropped it as they were fleeing. And as I said, I found gun barrels that have been probably spiked by the Germans as their ammunition ran out, and the pieces are just there on the floor. And I talked to locals, and ammunition is still found there regularly. Bodies are still found there regularly as well. There were 2 large burials which took place in Halbe in recent years. The local German War Graves Commission is responsible for finding soldiers' bodies and then burying them. I think 2 years ago, under 100 bodies were buried, and then the year before that was another 80. We're talking about, serious numbers of soldiers and civilians still being found 80 years later, which is, I think, a testament just to the size of the fighting and the size of the battle which took place.
Now, Beyond Barbarossa is so far tracking the development of the war at an 81-year gap or delay. So which brings my episodes up to 1944 currently. And so this is a bit of a jump. So could you give, for our listeners, just a brief summary of the progress of the Battle of the Halbe Pocket? When it happened,
Absolutely.
who was there?
Absolutely. The Battle of the Halbe Pocket is happening on the periphery of the Battle of Berlin. It's all happening within the larger Operation Berlin, which is not a very imaginative name, I must say, that the Red Army was using, but it's all part of their final assault on the Nazi capital. So in mid-April, the Red Army has collected 3 entire fronts along the Oder and Neisse rivers, which are the modern-day borders between Germany and Poland. And up in the north, you've got the Second Belarusian Front from Rokossovsky. In the middle, you've got Zhukov with the First Belarusian Front. And then to the south, you've got Konyev with the First Ukrainian Front. The combined numbers of men for those 3 fronts is about 2.5 million men, at least 7,000, 8,000 tanks. A similar number of Red Army Air Force planes are also flying in the skies at the time. The number of guns is, again, you're talking at least 5,000 or 6,000 guns. But in terms of the discrepancy or kind of the disparity of the Soviet army size compared to the German size, the main armed force the Wehrmacht is able to call on at the time is the German Ninth Army, which is part of Army Group Vistula. The German Ninth Army at the start of the fighting is only 200,000 men. So 200,000 men facing off, well, directly in front of them is Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, which is about 800,000 men.
Right.
So there's at least a 4-to-1 disparity in terms of manpower, and it's a similar disparity in terms of firepower as well, so number of guns and tanks. So that's setting the scene for the final invasion of Eastern Germany and Berlin, which the Soviets have timed to launch in mid-April. So April the 16th, they had taken a couple of months pause beforehand to kind of recoup and reinforce their frontline divisions after the Oder Vistula offensive, which was in January 1945. That's when they swept through Western Poland and Silesia and went up to the German border along the Oder and Neisse rivers. That had exhausted a lot of the Soviet reserves. They needed time to consolidate their forces. They were also still trying to crush the Courland pocket up in the Baltics. Yes. They were still besieging Königsberg in East Prussia. So they had many things to do. But by mid-April, they're ready to launch their final assault on Berlin. And that is where the Halbe Pocket story begins, because the German Ninth Army faces the head-on attack of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front along the Zilower Heights, which is about 60 kilometers east of Berlin. And whilst they are facing that head-on pressure from Zhukov's forces, Konyev's First Ukrainian Front forces to the south rapidly start encircling the Ninth Army. So they launch 2 tank armies, which launch a kind of blitzkrieg-style rapid attack and advance through central Brandenburg, swinging up to attack Berlin from the south. And so it's the quick movement of Konyev's force which leads to the first signs of the encirclement.
There was a race, wasn't there, between these 3 stars of the Red Army, Rokossovsky, Zhukov, and Konev. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Stalin's order to be in Berlin by May 1st?
Yes, absolutely. He certainly wanted the Reichstag to be captured by May the 1st, given it's the most holiest of Soviet public holidays, as you might call it. Zhukov's original plan was that he had intended to capture Berlin sooner than that, to give him some leeway. But you're absolutely right that it was the rivalry specifically between Konyev and Zhukov, which, in my view, leads to the direct kind of consequences of the Ninth Army being trapped, because they are both charged with assaulting Berlin. Zhukov thinks he has the easier head start, launching his attack only from 60 kilometers east of Berlin along the Zilower Heights. But Stalin still lays down the challenge to Konyev and says, even though you're starting further away from down in the south, if you can reach the town of Lubin in central Brandenburg quickly enough, then, I would, hint, not be against you swinging your armies northwards and to attack Berlin. And so it was a very tacit challenge laid down to Konyev to advance as quickly as possible. And that's why when Zhukov gets stuck along the Zilower Heights, which maybe we can talk about in a minute in more detail, that's what allows Konyev to then kind of seize the initiative And that's what's, I think, seals the death knell for the Ninth Army, because they're trapped between two Soviet fronts, both racing for Berlin. And that's what leads to them then being trapped between both of them in the Halbe area.
That glimpse into the future of Beyond Barbarossa is absolutely fascinating. This episode is going to be a long one, so let's take a short break. Back in a moment for part 2.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Thanks for coming back to episode 70 of Beyond Barbarossa, a podcast about the Eastern Front. We're joined by the podcaster of another new podcast about the Eastern Front, David Sumner of Europe at War. David. I was listening to the podcast, the first season about the Halbe Pocket. It really struck me how there was a simultaneous effort by the Germans, on the one hand, to resist at Halbe, but then the attempts to send other forces to rescue them. That's something that has actually played out time and again throughout 1943, 1944, as we saw in Western Ukraine at the right bank of the Dnieper, as various attempts to break out of the pockets at Cherkasy and so on.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I wanted to ask you about this. It was pretty evident, especially in April 1945, but I think for a lot of people, it was evident much earlier than that. They could not win. The Germans could not win in the East. They were outnumbered vastly. As you saw, this 4-1, and depending on what you count in there, up to 10-1 disadvantage, and just in terms of not only people, but in terms of tanks, of guns, of airplanes, and everything else. Some of the German generals seemed to realize this, but others didn't. And I'm just wondering, I know we can't look into people's heads, but what could they have been thinking?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about, did the German generals fear for their lives if they were to go against what Hitler was ordering them to do? We could take that as one possible motivation for why certain generals did what they did. So look at General Busse, who's the main general of the German Ninth Army. As I describe in the podcast, in the first few days of the Halbe Pocket story, he is towing the line, and he's very, very careful not to appear as if he is retreating. I mean, he's not even retreating out of necessity. He is being pushed back by an overwhelming Soviet onslaught. He has no choice, but he doesn't want to be seen to be retreating, because Hitler does issue orders saying if any officer takes one step west, then they should be shot on the spot. If that's hanging over your head as a possible outcome, then you don't want to be seen to be retreating. And if you are going to retreat, you are going to wait until you've got some kind of official authorization, or at least just a senior, general above you who is giving you cover to do so. And that's what ends up being in the story. General Busse does not start retreating until he gets some tacit approval from Heinrici above him, but via Hitler, that he is allowed to withdraw from that frontal pressure. And this whole concept of, the general's personality being so vital to how Germany fights the war in these latter weeks is absolutely vital to this story. My second series of the podcast is looking at the Battle of Bautzen. And down there, the head of Army Group Center, which is Ferdinand Shorner, was an ardent Nazi. He was a Hitler sycophant. He really did believe that if he launched a counterattack from Saxony, which is further south, that could break through into Brandenburg, it could magically also then reach Berlin and help relieve the city under siege. And he really did believe it. And he saw no concept of retreating from the Soviets, and that's why the Battle of Bautzen plays out the way that it does. But General Busse, Heinrici, and then also General Wenke, which is the other main player in my story of Halbe, they are realists. And they very quickly see that once the final Soviet assault on Berlin is launched in mid-April, there is nothing the Germans can do to stop it from succeeding. And the eventual story of the Halbe Pocket is how they kind of combine together, especially Wenke and Busse, to try and save as many of their soldiers as possible, but also save the German civilians which have been trapped in the pocket as well. And that led to the whole second part of my podcast, which is not so much on the Soviet invasion and the assault on Berlin, but is rather the breakout attempts by the German Ninth Army from the Halbe Pocket, leading on this kind of odyssey where they trek through the forests and fields and swamps of central Brandenburg for another 60 kilometers west before to link up with General Walther Wenke's army. And then they trek another 100 kilometers further west to reach the safety of American lines. I think at that point of the war, reaching American lines was definitely a motivation to keep going, if maybe not keep fighting, but definitely to keep going and just to not surrender to the Soviets.
They preferred to surrender to the American forces or the Western forces rather than the Soviets. Can you maybe give our listeners a little hint as to the reasons why?
Well, the reasons why, firstly, you have some units within the Ninth Army who do not want to surrender to the Soviets because they have perhaps worked. So one important element is that there are about 5,000 Hiwi soldiers. So this is the Hilfsbillinge, which they are Russian or they're Soviet citizens who were captured by the Wehrmacht and then agreed to fight for the Wehrmacht or serve within the Wehrmacht forces. There's still about 5,000 of them still serving within the Ninth Army by the time the Halbe Pocket forms. Now, they very obviously don't want to surrender to the Soviets because they know that's just going to give them a one-way ticket to a gulag. There are many SS units trapped in the pocket as well, and they also know that they are not going to be treated well by the Soviets. They'll be either shot on sight or they'll be worked to death very, very shortly. And from the civilian perspective, without going into too many kind of graphic details, the women who are trapped in the pocket certainly don't want to surrender to the Soviets because the stories of what was happening to German refugees and German civilians in East Prussia were by now well known, and people, and so many women, especially with children, did not want to run the risk of what might happen to them if they surrendered to Soviet soldiers. So I would say those are the main reasons why that kept them going and kept them that led them to rather surrender to the Americans. There was no, I think, knowledge that East Germany was going to fall into the Soviet zone of occupation. That has been talked about after the fact, but I think that's more German generals who were interviewed in the 60s were therefore trying to maybe talk about this in a Cold War perspective, trying to say that, they of course knew East Germany was going to become, a communist satellite state. Therefore, they were willing to go over to the West, but that wasn't really what they were fearing in May and April 1945.
I don't want to give too many spoilers away, although, as I have said to my audience a few times, we all kind of know how this ends.
Yeah.
Those attempts to reach the Americans, first part of the question is, were they successful, at least in part? And secondly, of those generals, Wenke, Busse, and Shorner, how many actually did survive the war?
All three generals survived the end of the war. And so Wenke and Busse successfully cross over the Tangermunde Bridge over the Elbe River towards the American side. And then Shorner is a funny story. Shorner is, as I said, he was an ardent Nazi who pushed his troops to fight to the bitter end. He himself did not stick around until the bitter end. His forces eventually end up in Czechoslovakia as part of the German defense of the Soviet push towards Prague. And at some point, he sees the writing on the wall. I think on May the 6th, he flies out of his area on a Storch light plane, and he flies all the way to Austria. And he escapes, and he is eventually captured and he goes into kind of I think it's American custody afterwards, where he eventually gets tried. But I'm not too sure how his eventual story ends. I think he is imprisoned and so forth. But all three of them survive the end point of the war, at least. Wenke and Busse. Wenke, for certain, it has become, I would say, a poster boy for one of the very few good Wehrmacht generals. I mean, he was quite lucky in that he had served up to during the war, but he was a very young general. He was the youngest general in the Wehrmacht, and his record was clean in that he hadn't really done anything bad. He hadn't served for any length of time, say in other major theaters. So he was very clean. Came in at the end of the war, and his one main claim to fame is this humanitarian rescue mission, as want of a better way of saying it. And he also very quickly was, I wouldn't say he was anti-Hitlerite, but he certainly knew it was a lost cause to go towards Berlin and try and save Hitler. And that kept his reputation up post-war. The crossing itself at Tangermünde was remarkably successful. The numbers of troops who crossed the river is... So historians, as you know, they like to debate numbers, and it's very hard to put a solid number on it. But the conservative estimate would be at least 100,000 people successfully cross. Now, the exact mix of soldier to civilian is contended, but it's at least 100,000 people. The upper estimates given by Wenke himself go into the region of maybe up to 300,000 civilians crossed with 100,000 soldiers. But like I said, Wenke is perhaps going to be likely to, bump up those numbers because it makes his story sound more grandiose. So that's why, the conservative estimate is at least 100,000. The very, very interesting thing about that crossing is you do start to see Cold War politics creeping into the story, where the Americans are very uneasy with accepting the surrender of such a large body of German troops. They don't want to do this and annoy the Russians. They know the Russians have been chasing this body of troops for the past two or 3 weeks, and that it would be a loss of face or a loss of honor if those troops escaped and surrendered to the Americans instead. So the Americans are very, very hesitant. At first, they only agree to accept unarmed soldiers. They refuse to accept any civilians. The view being that the civilians will just have to go back home after the war ends anyway. So what's the point? Plus, accepting that large number of civilians was also a headache for them in terms of logistics. How would the US... it's the U.S. Ninth Army. So it's the Ninth Army, but the U.S. Ninth Army. How would they house, feed, clothe potentially hundreds of thousands of German civilians at such short notice? And it's only when the final evacuation perimeter is kind of collapsing under the Soviet pressure. The Soviets are shelling the crossing points. Some shell bursts overhit, or they go over the heads of the Germans. They land on the American side, and they cause some friendly fire incidents. Some American soldiers are wounded. I think one is killed. This causes the US forces to pull back from the riverbank, and then, as there's no one guarding the riverbank, all of the Germans can then just cross. They can then cross unfettered, and when that happens, that's when the real mass of people come across. And surprisingly high numbers do survive and do cross, but still many, many hundreds, if not thousands of people are washed away in the river, or they're killed by incoming Russian fire, and they don't make it.
This is a long episode, so let's take another short break. Back soon. This episode is brought to you by the Eastern Front Trilogy, the true story of a Canadian man, Maurice Bury, drafted into the Soviet Red Army just in time to be thrown between the jaws of the USSR and Nazi Germany at the launch of the greatest land invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa. In 3 volumes, Army of Worn Souls, Under the Nazi Heel, and Walking Out of War. The Eastern Front Trilogy is the story of the largest and deadliest side of the Second World War, seen through the eyes of a man who was there from the earliest days in 1941 through Germany's grinding occupation of Ukraine, and finally to the savage end of the war in Berlin. You can find 3 individual volumes as ebooks exclusively on Amazon, or purchase the 3-volume complete paperback on any online book retailer or at your local bookstore. To learn more about the Eastern Front trilogy, visit scottburyauthor.com. Welcome back once again to Beyond Barbarossa, episode 70. We're joined by David Sumner of the Europe at War podcast, which describes the dramatic battles between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army in the last weeks of the Second World War. David.
Was there a sense, do you think, among the Americans or the other Western allies that maybe the Soviets would not be treating their prisoners as well as the Western allies would?
For sure.
Mhm.
But I don't think that was the overriding. They definitely knew. I mean, I think people in the West and Churchill and the other Allied leaders knew about Soviet gulags for many years, even before the war broke out. That was not news. There are other instances where the Allies very happily handed back soldiers straight back to the Russians, even if they have taken the surrender of German units. They just passed them back over. There's a famous example of the Cossacks. There's a Cossack regiment in Austria, I believe, who surrendered to the British and then get passed back to the Russians afterwards, because the Cossacks came from Russia, obviously, and the Cossacks are, as you can imagine, apoplectic. They are distraught. They are distressed because they know there's no good outcome for them if they go back to Russia. And as it turns out, many of them then do die.
Yeah.
So the Allies they were willing to suspend the humanitarian aspect for the political necessity of keeping the Russians on side. That plays out, as I said, also in the evacuations over the bridge at Tangamunda.
You mentioned that you do walk around, visit the forests in Halbe and Bautzen. Can you tell me, what was the first time that you thought, yeah, I'm gonna go check that out personally? What motivated you to do that?
Funnily enough, it was not the military side of the story. So it was not, I knew nothing about the Ninth Army. I knew nothing about General Busse and the rest of it. I was Googling, Second World War locations in my area, and the Halbe Forest Cemetery popped up. And the Halbe Forest Cemetery is one of, or if not the largest Second World War cemetery in Germany. Up to 28,000 people are buried there. And that got me asking, well, okay, why are they buried there? What happened here? And so that's when I made my first, pilgrimage down to the area. And you go through the town, and the cemetery is very, very well advertised, and it's a traditional kind of war graves cemetery, which we would have in the UK or in maybe even also in Canada, but it's a lot more somber. So it's a forest cemetery. There are some crosses in the vicinity, but most of the buried there just have a simple plaque on the floor. It's a lot of mass graves. There are individual graves if they have the identity of the person actually worked out, but I think more than half of the graves are still unidentified, and this is 80 years later. That's what attracted me to the story. And I was walking through the graves, and I saw the nationalities as well. A lot of them were German, of course. Then I saw, names pop up, and the surnames were very foreign. And I thought, I wonder if that's foreign SS volunteers. And it turns out that it was. And so I was like, okay, well, why would there be foreign SS? And that got me thinking. So that's what kind of got me intrigued with the area. And then I was doing reading, and I have a politics background, actually. I mean, history and the Second World War is always going to be my first love, but I have a politics background, and I studied here in Germany as well. And I started to read in how Halbe as a town had to deal with some very unpleasant elements in the 90s and in the early 2000s, where quite extreme right-wing elements were marching through the town and trying to glorify the whole Halbe Pocket story, because they were trying to claim, oh, look, this is an example of the good, noble Wehrmacht doing something very brave and trying to save certain, which is obviously a very one-sided view of history. And that got me thinking, well, how does the town deal with this legacy? And that's why I was inspired to tell the story, because I felt like it's our job as historians to really put the facts out there, because
Yes.
when facts are not put out there, then that's when heavily biased narratives fill that gap and then dominate the whole, chronology and the historiography of a story such as Halbe. I think I was most shocked. I went down to Halbe in January of this year, and I could see stickers around the local train station where there was an animated Wehrmacht soldier or a soldier in Wehrmacht uniform.
Ah.
And the German on top read, Opa war kein Mörder, which is Granddad was no murderer.
Oh.
And again, it was obviously a very, very biased, very, how do you say, ideologically driven view of history. Once again, trying to glorify this noble deed of the Wehrmacht and what they did in the Halbe Pocket. And I hoped that my podcast said that, or at least just tried to give the facts out there and say, yes, many bad things happened, happened in the Halbe Pocket, but the people who were fighting there were not angels. And there were some very nasty Nazis who were caught up in the Halbe Pocket, and I'm not shedding any tears for those guys. That's why I wanted to focus more on the human drama and the civilians who were trapped in there, because as we know in war, I think civilians are the ones with the least say in how things pan out. So very long-winded answer. I'm attracted by the human drama of the story,
Right.
and that's what drew me to Halbe in the first place.
That's a part of the tension, isn't it, in discussing World War or any war really, is it's the civilians who are often paying the highest price, but they don't get the history, they don't get the records because they're not taking records. The focus is on the military, and it's military logs and journals that are easiest to find. But there are some excellent new books coming out about, focusing on that part of it. Before we go on to my next idea, do tell me about what is the most significant or maybe the most striking artifact that you found on your journeys in the forest of the Halbe area?
Yeah, so I was down there recently. The area is very popular with metal detecting, kind of hunting people. I will say on the radio here that I don't do that, because under German law, that is a bit, let's say, it's a bit of a gray area, but many people do. And I saw a guy down there, and he was digging around, and he had found a whole cache of gas masks. There were easily 20 Wehrmacht issue gas masks that he had just dug up, which had obviously been dumped in the kind of heat of panic. Why the German army was still lugging around gas masks in April 1945 is beyond me, given that at least on the Eastern Front, the use of chemical warfare and gas warfare was obviously not the overriding story. But I've also personally found myself, I mentioned those gun fragments which I found. I was there with a friend, and we found some pieces of a gun barrel very close to the areas where the German Ninth Army leadership had their headquarters right before they did the final breakout. And so from my research, I knew that within this sector, there had been at least 10 to 15,000 troops and a similar number of civilians huddling up under the tree cover. Under the trees, obviously, they couldn't be spotted so easily by Soviet planes. And we could see shell holes that were spaced about 10 meters apart. And so if Foxhole is about 10 meters apart, that's a bit more planned. And that probably would be then the outskirts of a defensive position, where the Germans were setting up maybe machine gun posts around the territory. So that's when we found the exploded barrels, which we would therefore presume would be perhaps from an MG42, or perhaps even a larger self-propelled gun or something that the Germans had, which they had to spike when the ammunition ran out. But my personal favorite is the hair comb that I found. It's a very simple artifact.
And very intimate.
Very intimate. Yeah, very, very intimate. I mean, you always feel bad. You are holding a piece of someone's life from 80 years ago, and you can only imagine what the person went through and maybe even who they were. You have no idea who it could have belonged to, but you can obviously, your imagination runs away. That said, I do see it as an intense honor to live so close to an area where so much history happened. And I like to think, we are only 80 years later. There are still items there to be found, but in 100 years' time, they will all be gone. probably. So we are at that sweet spot in history where we can go and find the historical artifacts. We can talk about them. And if you're interested, I can also send you some pictures, and then you can put them up on your site as well to show your listeners what I'm actually referring to, because I think it's very, very interesting pieces of equipment that are still there to be found.
That would be wonderful. Yes. Now, your podcast is now on to the Battle of Bautzen. How many episodes do you have?
In total, the series will be 7 episodes. And so far, the first 2 episodes have been published. I'm publishing weekly, 7 episodes in total. The reason I picked Bautzen was because within the historiography, it's claimed as being the last German victory of the Second World War, which gives it a very snazzy title. Now, you and I and your listeners can probably all talk for hours about what does victory really mean, given the context that it's late April and they lose the war 2 weeks later anyway.
Yeah.
But yes,
Spoiler.
yes, the Germans do. Spoiler alert, they do lose. But within this very kind of localized engagement within the Bundesland or within the federal state of Saxony, the Germans do launch a successful counterattack, which does lead to some pretty amazing victories where they relieve the siege which is happening on Bautzen. So Bautzen is kind of recaptured by the Germans. Dresden is kept in German hands until the end of the war as a result of this German counterattack. And funnily enough, more German tanks serve within this theatre of battle, so in the Bautzen area and in Saxony in general, than are serving up in the defense of Berlin itself. So it's a lovely tidbit to show you that the Germans still don't have their priorities in the right order, even in late April. So
yeah, that would open up a whole new podcast series, I think.
Yeah. Mistakes of the Wehrmacht could be a 15-part series just by itself.
Yeah. So after Bautzen, do you have further plans to continue exploring the Eastern Front?
I do. I'm now currently researching and writing a series on the Battle of Berlin itself.
Right.
I chose the Battle of Berlin because the Berlin is my new adopted hometown, and also because it would be the kind of last part in my trilogy of looking at battles in and around Berlin. And so I figured, well, I have to end with the big one up in Berlin. But I am mindful that the Battle of Berlin is more known about. So I'd be telling the story and trying to add my own personal spin on it, given that I know the area and I know maybe a lot more unknown things, maybe than there are in history books. But after that, I've always been attracted by the Eastern Front. I grew up on stories of Arnhem and D-Day and the Battle of Britain and all these, very British-focused stories. But something always draws me back to the Eastern Front. There are so many unique parts of the fighting on the Eastern Front which just aren't even really there when it comes to the Western Front story. I'd say my favorite part of the Eastern Front story, but certainly one that attracts me in terms of interest, is the foreign SS volunteer units that serve within the German army. Most of those foreign SS, so the French SS units or the Flemish and the Dutch ones, all serve on the Eastern Front primarily because they are inspired to or conscripted or cajoled into joining the SS on the whole pretense of anti-Bolshevism. So it makes sense for these units to serve on the Eastern Front, and they're far more active there. So that might be a topic that I look to research and do a podcast on in the future.
That would be fascinating. That kind of leads us nicely into the surprise question. It's about the shift in historiography, especially after 1990. There were a lot of new books with new perspectives and new information on the war in the East, because a lot of information was just suppressed really by the former communist government. That suppression may be back, but anyway, as someone who's living in Germany, maybe provide a bit of perspective on this change in the records, or the opening up of new records, and the shift in the perspective on the war.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best example I give of a popular historian who used the shift in attitudes after the 90s for great effect obviously is Sir Anthony Beevor. In writing his book of Stalingrad, he was able to go to Russia and get access to the Russian archives in that small window in the mid-90s when it looked as if Russia was going to open up and liberalize and open up to the West. And he went over there and he got all these first-hand documents about the Battle of Stalingrad. And no historian could could do that now. No historian from the West could go to Russia now and get access to the Russian archives. So that's my very favorite example. Within Germany, if I talk about the concept of popular history, I mean, you still find very few popular history books that you would say find on the shelves in England. I mean, there are authors such as James Holland, who writes many, many books in the UK and is published quite widely. He has spoken many times that he cannot get published in German. There's very little appetite for the Second World War as maybe a form of educational entertainment, if I want to phrase it like that. You know, people just buy books as they want to read about the military stories. There's still very little attitude for that. The books you find in Germany about the Second World War are still very, very much focused on the rise of Hitler and the rise of Nazism, the death of Weimar democracy, and then, of course, the Holocaust, which then follows afterwards. German Second World War focus is still very much focused on those topics. And I've lived here for more than 15 years, as I said. Very few Germans I know could name you a German general that served in the Second World War.
Really?
They might know Rommel, but they won't know where Rommel or what Rommel did or why he's famous. Many of my German friends will learn the military part of the Second World War through films like Saving Private Ryan. They are not taught it in schools here. Many school classes will visit concentration camps or maybe even death camps, because that's what they want the school kids to learn, but they don't know anything about, you know, the Eastern Front or Operation Bagration or, you know, those kind of things. So I might just jump in once just for your listeners to maybe just one tidbit, which I'll leave them with before we maybe move on to a different topic. But this week in Germany, the debates have been raging about whether Germany could partake in the French and UK nuclear, capabilities. Could nuclear weapons be shared around European countries? And could Germany maybe borrow some French nuclear missiles? And the domestic political debate in Germany still harks back to the Second World War.
Yeah.
One of the political parties in parliament called Die Linke, which is the left party, like the far left party, their leader came out and said he's very uncomfortable with Germany having nuclear bombs or nuclear rockets and missiles due to Germany's history. And so he's making a direct link back to the Second World War.
Right.
And that's just proof to me that even 80 years on, the legacy of the Second World War can still shape German politics very, very heavily when it comes to how they deal with like military topics.
I guess podcasts like this are keeping that debate alive in one way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It's, as I said, it's our job as podcasters to give the facts and tell people what actually happened, because in that void, that's when maybe false narratives or biased narratives flourish.
And I think that's a good note to end on. So I'm going to say thank you to David Sumner for appearing on Beyond Barbarossa, and his podcast is Europe at War.
Thank you for having me, Scott. It's been a pleasure, and looking forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks once again to David Sumner of the Europe at War podcast. I've put a link to his podcast in the show notes and on the webpage for this episode, number 70 of Beyond Barbarossa. You'll find some of David's photos from his latest visit to the Halbe Forest there too. I'll be appearing on Europe at War. Again, the links are in the show notes and on the webpage. Share and tell your friends. Next episode is also going to be a very special one. Watch your news feed and social media to find out more. I'm on Blue Sky, scottthewriter.bsky.social, and on Instagram, Scott Burry Author. You can also find Beyond Barbarossa on Facebook. You can get notifications of new episodes of Beyond Barbarossa and all your favorite World War II podcasts by registering for free at feedspot.com. That's feedspot.com. And don't forget that Patreon supporters get all episodes early, ad-free, and with graphics, maps, and photos. Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support you're comfortable with. Thanks to Sydney Tobias and to Bruce, who have recently joined the ranks of Patreon supporters. And thanks to all patrons. Your regular support makes a huge difference. I want to thank all of you also for listening to Beyond Barbarossa, the podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. Please follow Beyond Barbarossa on your preferred podcasting app. If you have a moment, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, or wherever you listen. That helps other history enthusiasts discover the show. Do you have a question for David or me? Something to add? Maybe you found some World War II artifacts or inherited a memento. Let us know. Send an email to scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca or leave a comment on the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. We love hearing from listeners. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Bury. I'm Scott Bury. Until next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina i heroям slava.